Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a preview of the Sony A7R Mark IV. This camera was announced this morning, July 16th, 2019, and will be released in September of this year for $3,500 US. That is for the body alone. Now, this is the most expensive A7R to date. You can see here I've got the A7R Mark II next to the A7R Mark III. And these are two of my favorite cameras, hands down, best-in-class performers, not only in the mirrorless interchangeable lens world, but in the entire interchangeable lens full-frame landscape. So the A7R Mark IV has a lot to live up to, a lot of expectations, and I think Sony did a solid job with this offering. First and foremost, we're moving from the 40 plus megapixel sensor up to a 61 megapixel sensor. And this is the highest megapixel count we've ever seen from Sony in a full frame 35 millimeter sensor. 15 stops of enhanced dynamic range, 10 frames per second continuous shooting, much like the A7R Mark III, but they've increased the buffer size. The most important feature that you're going to see with the A7R Mark IV is the increased number of phase detection autofocus points. We've moved from 399 with the Mark III up to 567 points of phase detection. So why is that significant? It's only 74% of the frame, that is the full frame, but when you drop down to Aps-C mode, you're getting nearly 100% coverage. It's not exactly 100, it's less than that. It's probably somewhere around 92 or 3%, but that is still an incredible range of autofocus capability in terms of sensor coverage. And that also means that since the A7R Mark IV has been blessed with real-time tracking autofocus in the video realm as well, that means when you are shooting 4K video with it, the autofocus should be pretty much amazing. Now, we've yet to see any real footage from this camera. Sony, in their press release, the online streaming event, showed only a 5-second clip of the real-time tracking for video, but I expect really good things, especially when you take into account what we've seen out of the Sony A6400. So that real-time eye autofocus for still movie capability, and of course human and animal eye focus is all there. So what you expected to be in the A7R IV with regard to autofocus capability, I think they have lived up to, if not exceeded expectations. What they didn't deliver, which was rumored this morning, was 4K at 60p or possibly 8K video capture. I don't really care that 8K isn't here. I would have liked to have seen 4K at 60p, but still, I think that since this isn't the A7S line, and it is the resolution line, this is right in line with expectations. So we've got S-Log 2 and 3, HLG, still no 10-bit. Would have liked to have seen that. We don't have it. The multi-interface shoe now can accept a digital audio interface for the brand new microphone they launched today as well, which is another nice thing that you can't get with either of these models. 5.5 stops with the 5-axis in-body image stabilization. They've also improved the EVF. So the OLED EVF is now 1.6 times higher fidelity in terms of, the actual dot count than what we have with the A7R Mark III. So that's another significant improvement. Is it one that warrants upgrading from the A7R Mark II or III? Not necessarily, but real-world use, that 5.76 million dot OLED viewfinder is certainly welcomed. I would love to have it on either of these cameras. Of course, I do not. They've also integrated, for the first time, dual-band Wi-Fi, which, if you follow my channel, you know I've been asking Sony to upgrade their Wi-Fi chipset for years. It has always astounded me with cameras like the A7R Mark II or Mark III. We're spending thousands of dollars, over $3,000 on each of these models, but we have one of the weakest Wi-Fi chipsets you could ever imagine, incredibly dated. In fact, it took until 2017 to finally get a Type-C port, which we have here. Even with the A9, that was not a feature, in spite of the fact that the A9 got the new battery type, and integrated Ethernet. Here we finally got Type-C. Now we're finally getting dual band Wi-Fi so that you can actually actively monitor your images. I'm not sure what's going to happen on the video side of things, but that would be great if we can. I mean, they're calling it faster data transfer across Wi-Fi and, of course, Type-C. And then the last, but certainly not least element of the upgrade is the grip. The grip has been changed, and I'm going to show you images of that shortly so you can see it. The question is this enough? You know, they've obviously had to introduce a new vertical grip as well for the Mark IV because they've changed the body, and I'm going to show you now exactly what we're talking about. You know, real-world images. I pulled them from Sony Alpha Rumors, which is a great source of information. Sometimes he gets things right. Often they're wrong, but I'd rather have it than not. No question about that. So I'm just going to bring a tablet on screen here for a second and just show you. So right there, we've got side by side the A7R, get that light out of the way if I can, the A7R Mark IV on the right and the Mark III on the left. So 128.9 millimeters in terms of width versus the Mark III's 126.9. And then when it comes to height, we're moving from 95.6 millimeters with the Mark III up to 96.4 millimeters. So a very small bump up in size. You can see a side-by-side look at it right there, which I think is, they're very, very similar. The grip just got a little more robust, and Sony claims that's a result of user feedback. I personally had no issues with the existing grip on the Mark II or the Mark III, which was a revamp. So to me, this is something that I don't personally need, but if you are one of those people that felt the grip was too small, and I can understand why, there's nothing wrong with getting a beefier grip, you've got it. And then with regards to the overall size, not much of a difference. Now, as I mentioned earlier, is this camera worth the upgrade? This becomes a bit of a head scratcher because over the years, I have jumped on every brand new A7R, and that's because they've all been groundbreaking. And that's not to say that this brand new 61 megapixel sensor isn't, because it is. I mean, when you look at these two cameras, this sensor came out in 2015, this sensor came out in 2017, so it's absolutely significant that this is the first 61 megapixel sensor and refresh of the A7R sensor since 2017. And that generally would be a scenario where I would say to Sony, you know, take my money. On this, I'm not so sure, because I've mentioned all of the brand new and really exciting enhancements that this camera has to offer, and they primarily live in the autofocus system, which of course bests that of the A7R Mark III, the EVF, the Wi-Fi chipset, and what I haven't heard anything about is battery life. I did forget to mention the UHS, the SD card slots now both support UHS 2. On the A7R Mark III, that was a big complaint. We only had a single UHS 2 slot. It didn't make a hell of a lot of sense since we had two slots. Why only give us a single UHS 2 slot? So they did update that, but does that really amount to a new model? I mean, the new sensor, I think, does. The new autofocus prowess does. But that's where things end. And I think a lot of users were looking for more. And I personally can't say for me as an owner of the A7R Mark III, and this is a first, and I feel like this is deja vu with the A6400, and it's not that the A6400 wasn't a great APS-C offering. It was, it is. It still is arguably the best on the market for its price point, no question at all. But does that camera, the A7R Mark IV, do enough to separate itself from the Mark III? And I'm not sure that it does. I mean, with regard to the megapixel count, I don't feel that it's just another megapixel war, which this camera has kind of gotten that rap, and I don't agree with that at all. But while that list of improvements are all things that I welcome and I would like, I feel that they're only going to be truly significant to someone moving from something like the A7R Mark II or the first generation A7R. I don't think moving from the A7R Mark III to the 4, we are seeing what users necessarily wanted. I personally haven't heard many users that were lusting after a higher megapixel count. So while Sony is branding this as a medium format rival because of its actual sensor, even though it's still full frame, but 61 megapixel sensor, along with the dynamic range capability and the ability to also capture, I think it was up to 920 some odd megapixels in a single still using the pixel shift technology. That's really cool. But that being the bread and butter of Sony's sales in this sector of these types of cameras to professionals and consumers alike, I'm not sure that the higher megapixel count and that capability equates to, again, the typical bread and butter that the R lineup represents. Now, I am excited about this sensor because I do anticipate that we're going to see this sensor hopefully end up in an RX camera. I mean, if we can get a new RX1, I will be delighted. I assure you of that. But just to get an update of this camera in the form of a 61 megapixel sensor, I mean, I expected improved autofocus. I expected those things because we saw it in the A6400. And we know that eventually those enhancements are going to find their way to the Pro models. And that's what the R is all about. I mean, this is the resolution model. So while I'm not shocked that we went up to 61, remember, that's the first time that we've made a jump in a really long time. So I welcome it, but I'm not sure that the industry was after anything higher because it doesn't really equate to necessarily better performance. In fact, Sony sent me an email later in the day showing images from the camera because they didn't do that during the press conference. They had a single image, literally, taken with a model where they showed us how much detail was retained doing a 100% crop on an eyeball, and that's great. Don't get me wrong. It's very impressive, but at the end of the day, the real upgrades here are the EVF, getting 2 UHS-2 slots, revamped Wi-Fi. Again, no mention of battery life. I would have liked to have seen some battery life specs to know whether or not we're losing battery life. I anticipate that we are. I mean, the new battery that we got back in 2017 with the A9 and then the A7R Mark III was a very welcomed addition. But, the truth of the matter is that I have to imagine the battery life is taking a hit. And, they did revamp controls a little bit. Just to give you a quick look at that, I'm going to flip around the A7R Mark III. I'm going to take the Mark II out of the lineup because, well, quite frankly, it is kind of out of the lineup. And I brought both of these cameras because I do think they are going to be steals over time. And that's the other thing that I think Sony is going to, as they always do, compete with themselves. But Sony embraces that, and that's part of their success too. I mean, right now, this camera is going for $2,500. This camera is, I think the body is sitting somewhere around $1,600, $1,700. These cameras are already bargains. So now with the A7R Mark IV coming into play, I think you're just going to have an even better option list as a consumer, whether you're at the pro level or, hobbyist, enthusiast. But in terms of what has been revamped with controls, I want to show that as well. So we're looking, again, top view of the A7R Mark III right here, and you can see the layout of controls, right? So on the A7R Mark IV, we have a new dial right next to the exposure compensation, and in between it and the mode dial. Beyond that, pretty much the same. I mean, it's a locking button, but there you can see it right there. That is the change. So again, Mark IV right there, Mark III coming back into focus. And then in terms of the rest of the body, everything is virtually the same. The back of the camera, they've changed these are not, in my opinion, significant changes. So a close-up here of the Mark III. So you can see the dial, the joystick that was added to the Mark III now has been revamped. I think that's pretty much it. I'm looking at everything in the image just to verify. They've changed the buttons a little bit, but the important changes were made in this revamp. So here we have the Mark IV, and you can see right here that we have a new joystick. It's a little beefier, kind of like the grip. We also have the autofocus button is a little more robust. It's actually popped out now in terms of selecting the focus. And then C3 menu, they're in the same position, but they've changed them a little bit. They've given them basically a lip that they don't have around them. Video record button is in the same position. The dial here, exactly the same. So really, these are cosmetic touch-ups, if you will. Nothing more than that. And I don't think that's a bad thing by any measure, but it's also not going to bring new purchases to the table. Now, the microphone they announced is pretty cool. 8 capsules in there, first digital mic that they're offering that can actually capture the audio straight through the hot shoe. I like that. $350 I think is a reasonable price if the microphone performs as suggested. But the digital audio you're only going to capture with the new multi-interface hot shoe on the A7R Mark IV. So while this will work with the Mark III, the A9, the Mark II, it will not be digital transmission. You will be getting an analog signal and have to go through the microphone jack. So that's kind of sad. At least that's my understanding. If I'm incorrect, I stand to be corrected. But that's also going to be released in September. Hopefully I'll have both of these to review for all of you. I mean, this is a preview for a reason. I plan on reviewing it. The mic is the ECM B1M. And it's also significant because Sony hasn't done anything in the realm of new microphones in quite some time. And I was pretty confident that we were going to see an A9 today or an A7R Mark IV and not a APS-C type sensor because all of the lenses we've seen announced recently have been full frame. The Olympics are a year away. Sony has to deliver more bodies that are going to accommodate professionals, especially with the Olympics being in Japan. So it makes sense that we would see a full frame offering. Now, a lot of people thought it was going to be an A7S. I have news for all of the A7S users. It's a great camera, but there's a reason Sony has not pushed to get it to market sooner. And it's not just technological problems or hurdles that they're having to jump. It's about where they make money. And they are in business, lest we forget. And the A7R series, as I mentioned earlier in this video, is truly the bread and butter of Sony's bottom line. And that's why there's so much emphasis on this model. It has been a success for many years. And there's a reason Sony was waiting to reveal this. And that's because it does overlap also into, or it can with that 10 frames per second, into the sports market as well. It's not the A9, it's not the fastest autofocus system on the planet, but it's up there. It certainly trounces the competition with its this model's megapixel count, now at the 61 megapixel count. And the dynamic range, it's setting a new bar. So that is important to remember. And I think that's exactly where Sony is coming from with this product, is that show us someone that competes with us. And there's no one. And that's the beauty of what Sony's done with the Mark IV. Again, do I think it will be enough to bring Mark III users to the table? If money is no object, yes. I mean, if I wasn't considering that, then I would say absolutely I'm picking it up. But because I have this camera, enjoy using this camera, the Mark III, I still enjoy the Mark II. It's not antiquated. Yeah, the battery type is antiquated, but other than that, it's a monster. So where do I draw the line? Well, this can do 5 frames continuous. This can do 10. And the new model can do 10. I think in the APS-C mode, they were talking about that you can jump all the way up to, I think it was from 68. It's a double or something to that effect in terms of the buffer. So, I mean, there's a lot to like there, but I don't see enough for me personally, even with the improvement in autofocus, to lay down new cash. And that's because this camera does a fantastic job. If I really wanted to step towards autofocus, it would be the A9, but that's the whole point. This kind of gives you, much like this camera did, the best of both worlds in terms of resolution and autofocus performance, especially now with the fact that we have high-speed continuous focus in still and video, which is something we didn't have before. But I kind of expected that because of the A6400 and what it lent itself to. So, all of these additions are very positive improvements for Sony, but at the end of the day, I don't feel compelled to lay down, especially, and this is where I mentioned at the top of the video, the $3,500 price point being an increase. I don't think it's an unreasonable increase, but even if this camera was slated at $3,200, like all of its predecessors, I'm not sure that I'd be lining up to purchase it because I don't feel it's that incredible of an upgrade. And don't get me wrong, it is still a game changer. It is still a brand new sensor that is going to shape imaging and how we look at it. But I also know inherently The price on this body, like all new bodies, is going to drop. I think it will be on the market for 2 years, much like the A7R Mark III and the A7R Mark II. So it will hold that spot for a while. But whether or not the video and still capability is something that you need, and remember, we're talking about a higher megapixel count, better dynamic range, and of course, autofocus in video that didn't exist, but otherwise, virtually a lot of the same. I mean, I don't know how much cleaner the video is going to look. I expect it to look better, but the video out of the A7R Mark III is already fantastic, and I don't have expectations to get that much more out of it. Now, if you need the extra resolution, it's a no-brainer. You've got it. I mean, you're moving from, a 40 plus megapixel sensor to 61. And the beauty of this is that now at the APS-C level, not only do you have nearly full sensor coverage, but you also have a 24 megapixel camera. So you kind of have an APS-C and full frame monster all in one, which I think is the pitch on this, is that you have the best of APS-C and full frame in a single body. And I love the idea of that, but not enough to dump this camera. So I guess the way I'm rounding this out is that the Sony A7R Mark IV is a fantastic looking camera on paper, and I don't doubt that it'll be a fantastic performer. But at $3,500, I expected more than getting just, a megapixel bump up that I personally do not need, and I think a lot of photographers do not need, whether you're a pro or an amateur. I'm not sure that anyone needs 61. It's a good bragging right. I still don't think that Sony's trying to just, fuel a megapixel war, because they don't need to do that. They're ahead of everyone in this game. So I don't buy into the simple megapixel war. But the fact that I don't need those extra megapixels, and that's why they're pitching this as a medium format competitor, because you really can't appeal to anyone else other than people that wouldn't look at the A7R Mark III because it wasn't medium format. And so now they're trying to say, well, with the 4, we have a sensor comparable to medium format, so you should give it a look. I think that's what they're going for. And then all of the other features are really just modernizing and listening to consumers so that they get it right, so that they don't just have something great on paper, but they have something you're going to want to use. And that is what the A7R is all about. It is the camera that everybody wants and that not everybody can afford. So I respect that, but I really wish that we would have at least seen 4K at 60p, 10-bit. I mean, if you would have delivered that, then it doesn't kill the prospect of the A7S. It merely makes the A7R what it always is, the best of both worlds. And the fact that, maybe that's going to be delivered in firmware. Who knows? That's the other thing I'm waiting to see, is what are we going to get from firmware? And that should be interesting. Otherwise, I've covered everything that you really need to know. This is all about, it is an incremental update, but it also isn't. And that's because you are now getting a brand new sensor. So nothing about getting a new sensor is incremental. But when you look at performance and when you look at the fact that the biggest gain you're getting with this is that megapixel bump to 61 and the ability at APS-C to sit at 24, and then of course the autofocus performance, it feels very incremental, I gotta say. And that's why that's why I saw today that the press reaction to this camera, I don't think was what Sony expected it to be. And that's why we continued to hear a basic applause for where I think Sony thought people were going to go gaga. And that didn't happen. And there's a reason. It's because this is an impressive camera, but Sony has always raised the bar to such a high level that I think people were waiting for something revolutionary and not so incremental feeling, in spite of the fact that, again, a new sensor is anything but incremental. Come on, everybody knows that. A new sensor is meaningful, especially from Sony. They are the best sensor manufacturer in the world. That's why they were able to brag at that press conference that they're in half of the world's smartphones. And that even if you don't care about cameras and you think your smartphone is the best camera you have, you likely are using a Sony sensor. And that is significant. But this camera, I wish, had just a little more pizzazz. How do I put it? A little more oomph. While it's a beast in every way possible, at the end of the day, that new sensor, better autofocus system, 2 UHS-2 slots, better EVF, redesigned grip and button layout, mildly tweaked. It just feels incremental. So, again, the A7R IV, I'm very impressed with. Looks great. I think it should have stayed at the same price point, but at the same time, I can understand Sony bumping up the price. But I really feel what you're looking at here, this is the news of the day, because these two cameras are going to become incredibly, reasonably priced for what they can do. And that's why I say the A7R Mark IV looks like the type of camera I'll be waiting on. And if I didn't own the A7R Mark III, I would probably be buying it. That's the best way I can put it. But as someone who's owned every version of the A7R, you know, if I was still sitting with the first gen, I'd be on it. If I was sitting with this camera, I might purchase it without hesitation. But knowing that if I sold these tomorrow, it would net, you know, just enough money, you know, a little bit more, then I would need to pick up, or maybe just exactly what I would need to pick up this body new. That kind of sums things up, folks, at least from my perspective. So, like everything I saw, sorry for the long rant. Actually, I'm not sorry. It's significant. This is the first new sensor we've got since 2017. But I'm excited about it. I just wish I was more excited. And that really boils down to whether or not this offering has changed the game. And I don't think that it has. I think that it is evidence of Sony grabbing all of the market share that they've wanted and that they're successful. And now they have the ability to be more incremental than ever before, even with a brand new sensor. That's where I think we find ourselves here in 2019. So it's an exciting camera, but it's very expensive. And I think the A7R III is still far too competent to be forgotten. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Let's hope for an RX1 follow-up. Fingers crossed. As I said, post those comments, questions. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.